Tonight, perhaps your mind is still trying to mend something. A conversation that ended awkwardly. A mistake that refuses to become yesterday. A future that keeps asking to be rehearsed before it arrives. If so, you are not alone. Many of us have quietly come to believe that peace waits just beyond one more correction, one more answer, one more improvement, one more thing finally made right. We fall asleep searching for cracks that no one else can see, carrying invisible tools long after the day's work has ended. But what if nothing in this moment is asking to be repaired? What if the deepest rest does not come from making life perfect, but from discovering that it was never waiting for perfection in the first place? Tonight's story begins in a quiet valley where the river has never tried to straighten itself, where crooked pines have never apologized for the way they grew, and where even broken things are allowed to remain part of the landscape without becoming mistakes. Stay here for a little while. There is nothing you need to solve before morning. Only listen. The valley has been waiting far longer than your worries have existed. Before the village had a name that anyone still remembered, there was only the valley. In the village of Amber Hollow, where the road forked at the edge of the market square, there lived a man named Kenji who could fix almost anything that came to him broken. He had not always known this about himself. As a boy, he remembered only that he noticed things other children did not notice. The small given a floorboard before it cracked all the way through. The faint wobble in a cartwheel 2 seasons before its axle finally failed. The particular silence that fell over his parents' house in the evenings when something between them had gone unspoken for too long. He noticed these things the way some children notice colors or music or the exact moment a storm is about to break. Not because he tried to, but because his mind simply moved that way, drawn toward the smallest signs of coming trouble, the way a moth is drawn toward a lit window. For a long while, this was simply a quiet habit of his attention, nothing more. It became something else. The winter he turned 14, when his grandfather, who had kept the little shop at the crossroads for 40 years before him, grew too ill to hold a tool steady, and someone had to keep the villagers' bowls and kettles and cartwheels in working order until spring. Kenji was the one who could. He remembered that winter often in later years, how his hands, still a boy's hands, had learned to steady themselves around another man's broken things. How the satisfaction of setting a cracked handle right, of seeing a wobbling wheel run true again, had filled something in him that he had not known was empty. His grandfather recovered enough to sit beside him at the bench through most of that winter, offering a word here and there. But by spring it was clear to everyone in Amber Hollow, and clearest of all to Kenji himself, that the shop at the crossroads had quietly changed hands. By the time this story begins, Kenji was neither young nor old, a man somewhere in the unremarkable middle of his years, his hair still dark but beginning to silver faintly at the temples, his hands broad and sun-brown and marked here and there with the pale scars that come from a lifetime spent close to blades and kilns and hot metal. He was not a large man, nor a loud one. He moved through the village the way a familiar tool moves through a familiar hand, unremarked upon, simply expected, simply there. His shop sat at the crossroads where the road to the mill met the road to the temple, a low wooden building with a deep overhanging roof that kept the bench dry even in the heaviest rains. Inside, the shelves were lined with the quiet evidence of 40 years of mending. Bowls with their cracks sealed invisible. Tool handles rebound in leather. A cartwheel or two waiting their turn. And on the highest shelf, dusty now, the small clay lamp that his grandfather had always claimed had burned since before even he could remember, though Kenji privately suspected this was simply the kind of thing old men said about the objects they loved. "You have a gift," the villagers told him again and again over the years, and Kenji had come to believe this was true, more than true. He had come to believe it was the whole and entire shape of who he was, a man who fixed things. Ask him in those years what he would be without a crack to mend, and he would have laughed, the way one laughs at a question too strange to take seriously, and gone back to his work. He did not consider this a burden in those years. He considered it his purpose, in the unquestioning way a stream considers its bed a purpose, never once wondering why it runs where it runs, never once imagining that it might, on some quiet morning, simply choose to run differently, or not run at all, and let the land around it settle into whatever shape it wished. On the particular morning this story begins in earnest, the pines on the hill above the village had just begun to turn, the deep green of summer giving way at the tips of the branches to the first hints of autumn's copper, and the air had that clean, cool sharpness that arrives each year a few weeks before the first true frost. Kenji sat at his bench in the grey early light, a bowl in his hands that had been brought to him the evening before, a plain clay bowl, cracked clean across the base, waiting for his attention the way dozens of bowls had waited before it, and dozens more would wait after. He did not yet know that this particular season, this particular autumn, among all the autumns he had lived through at that bench, would ask something of him that no crack, no wobble, no broken axle ever had. He only knew, as he turned the bowl slowly in the morning light, checking the line of the break, that it was a fine morning for mending, and that there was nowhere else in the world he would rather be than exactly here, hands full of something waiting to be made whole again. He set to work. The shop was quiet. Somewhere down the lane, a rooster called the last of the night away, and the village of Amber Hollow began, unhurried, to wake. The old monk lived at the far edge of the village, past the last of the market stalls, past even the last of the houses, where the lane narrowed to little more than a footpath and climbed gently toward the stand of pines on the hill. His hut sat just beneath those trees, so small and so weathered by rain and years that from a distance it seemed almost to be growing out of the hillside itself, rather than built upon it. His name was Tao Yun, though few in the village used it. Most simply called him the Old One at the Pines, the way one might refer to a familiar landmark rather than a person. The river bend, the crossroads, the Old One at the Pines. He had lived there longer than anyone could quite say. Longer, some claimed, than Kenji's grandfather had kept the shop, though no one had ever thought to ask him directly, and he had never offered the number himself. He came down into the village perhaps once a month, sometimes less in the coldest part of winter, walking with the unhurried, deliberate steps of a man who had long ago stopped measuring distance by how quickly it could be crossed. He carried almost nothing with him on these visits. A small cloth bag, sometimes a walking stick worn smooth by decades of use, and always tucked into the folds of his robe. A plain clay bowl he used for whatever rice or millet the villagers offered him along the way. On the particular morning that Kenji's story turns toward him, the old monk stopped at the shop at the crossroads, not to buy anything, not even to ask for anything, but simply to rest a while in the shade the deep eaves provided, as he sometimes did on his slow walk through the village. Kenji had known him, in the distant way one knows a familiar face, for as long as he could remember. A nod exchanged in the market, a few words traded on a cold morning. Nothing more. He did not know him well, but he knew him well enough to notice, almost without meaning to, the shape of the bowl tucked into the folds of the old man's robe. Though it was a plain thing, unglazed, the color of the clay it had been shaped from, worn smooth along its rim by years of hands and lips, and running from that rim down to its base, catching the morning light at just the angle to be visible, was a single hairline crack. It did not leak, as far as Kenji could tell from where he sat. It did not wobble or threaten to come apart in the old man's hands. But it was, unmistakably, undeniably, broken. The kind of small, clean fracture that Kenji had spent his entire working life learning to notice and to mend and to make disappear. "I could repair that for you," Kenji said, setting down the tool he had been holding, already reaching without quite deciding to for the small kit of clay paste and binding thread he kept near at hand for exactly this kind of quiet, simple work. It would take no time at all. A crack that size, in clay that fine. I could have it sealed before the sun moves past the temple roof. The old monk looked down at the bowl in his hands as though he had, for a moment, genuinely forgotten it was there at all, the way a person sometimes forgets the shape of their own worn shoes or the familiar ache in an old joint, simply because it has been part of them for so long that it no longer announces itself. It holds rice just as well as it did the day before it cracked, Tao Yun said, in the unhurried, unbothered way he said most things. "I don't believe it's asking to be mended." Kenji laughed at this, not unkindly, but the easy, automatic laugh of a man confronted with something too simple to be taken seriously. "Everything that is broken is asking to be mended," he said. "That is what broken means. A crack doesn't ask permission before it forms, and it will not close itself either. Someone must close it. That is the nature of the thing." He said this the way he might have explained that water runs downhill or that fire needs air to burn, not as an opinion, but as a fact so plain it hardly seemed worth discussing. The old monk did not argue with him. He only turned the bowl slowly in his weathered hands, watching the crack catch the light and lose it again as the angle shifted, the way one might watch a familiar constellation shift across a night sky. He seemed in that unhurried turning to be looking at something Kenji could not quite see. Not the crack itself, perhaps, but everything the crack had come to mean over however many years it had been there. "Perhaps," Tao Yun said at last, "not everything that is broken is asking the same question." Kenji frowned slightly at this, uncertain what to make of it. The way a man frowns at a riddle he suspects is not really meant to be solved. Before he could ask what the old monk meant, Tao Yun had already tucked the bowl back into the folds of his robe and risen slowly from the bench in the shade and thanked Kenji for the shelter of his eaves in the plain, unhurried way he thanked people for small things. a thanks that asked for nothing further and offered no further explanation. Kenji watched him go, walking his slow, deliberate path on toward the market stalls further down the lane, and found himself sitting for a long moment afterward without picking his tools back up, turning the exchange over in his mind the way he might turn a stone to see if there was something written on its underside. It was not that he was troubled exactly. He told himself this several times over the course of that morning, as he returned eventually to the bowl waiting on his own bench. The ordinary cracked bowl a neighbor had brought him the evening before, its break clean and simple and entirely willing, as far as Kenji could tell, to be mended. He worked the clay paste carefully along the fracture, bound it with the fine thread he used for such repairs, and set it near the small fire to cure. It was not that he was troubled exactly. He told himself this several times over the course of that morning, as he returned eventually to the bowl waiting on his own bench, the ordinary cracked bowl a neighbor had brought him the evening before, its break clean and simple and entirely willing, as far as Kenji could tell, to be mended. He worked the clay paste carefully along the fracture, bound it with the fine thread he used for such repairs, and set it near the small fire to cure, and told himself, as he always did at this stage of a repair, that there was a particular satisfaction in watching a broken thing return, however invisibly, to wholeness. But some part of his attention kept drifting back to the old monk's slow, unhurried turning of that other bowl in the shade, to the way his weathered hands had moved not to hide the crack or to measure it for a mender's eye, but simply to hold it, the way one might hold something they had long since stopped thinking of as damaged at all. He found, faintly, that this unsettled him, the way a man is unsettled when someone declines a gift he was entirely certain would be welcomed, not because the refusal itself was unkind, but because it suggested, however quietly, that his own certainty about the shape of things might not be as complete as he had always believed it to be. He did not dwell on this for long. There was, after all, work waiting at the bench, and a village full of small broken things that would, unlike the old monk's bowl, be glad enough for his hands to find them. By midday, the thought of the crack in Taoyun's bowl had settled quietly to the back of his mind, the way most passing unease does in a life kept busy, not resolved exactly, only set aside, the way one sets aside a stone picked up on a walk, meaning to look at it again later, and then simply forgetting for a while that it is still there. The afternoon light lengthened across the shop floor. Somewhere beyond the open door, the sound of the market settled into its familiar late-day murmur, and Kenji bent back over his bench, his hands moving with their old, sure confidence toward the next small brokenness waiting to be made whole. That evening, after the shop had gone quiet and the last of the market's noise had faded into the ordinary sounds of the village settling toward dusk, Kenji's apprentice asked him something that stopped his hands for a moment on the bench. The boy's name was Hiro. He had come to Kenji 3 years before, a thin, watchful child sent by an aunt who could no longer feed an extra mouth through the winter, and he had been sweeping the shop floor and fetching water and watching Kenji's hands at the bench long enough now that he had begun in his own quiet way to pay close attention. "Master Kenji," Hiro said, setting the broom against the wall rather than heading off to his evening chores. "Why do you fix things? Kenji looked up from the chair leg he had been gluing. His hands, which had been moving on their own for years now, simply stopped. "Because they are broken," he said. "But why does that matter?" Kenji opened his mouth to answer the way he always answered, and found, oddly, that nothing arrived. He looked down at the chair leg in his hands. He looked at the shelf behind him, lined with the day's small mendings drying in neat rows. He looked, finally, at Hero, who was only waiting, not pressing, the way children wait for grown answers to grown questions. "It matters," he said, "because things should be whole." He said it the way he always said things at the bench, plainly, as if it settled the matter. Hero nodded the way he nodded at most of Kenji's answers, and picked his broom back up and went to finish his chores, and the shop was quiet again. Kenji sat a while longer with the chair leg in his hands. After some time, he noticed he was not gluing it. He was only holding it. He set it down and went to bank the coals for the night. The fire had burned low, the way it always did at that hour, and he moved through the familiar motions of closing the shop. Tools returned to their places. The day's repairs left to cure. The door latched against the chill. He paused without quite meaning to, at the shelf of finished mendings, each one a little quieter than it had been that morning, and stood there longer than the task required. Outside, someone's dog barked twice down the lane and went silent. A cart passed on the road toward the mill. Kenji listened to these ordinary sounds the way a man listens when he is not thinking of anything in particular, and found when he finally climbed the narrow stair to his sleeping loft, that sleep was slower to come than usual. Not because any thought kept him awake, but because there seemed somehow to be a little less to fill the dark with than there usually was. He told himself it was simply a long day. He believed this readily enough, and by morning, in the ordinary business of the shop, he had all but forgotten the shape of the question Hero had asked him, though not quite the small, unfamiliar quiet that had followed it, which stayed with him the way a draft stays in a room long after the door that let it in has been closed. The first true storm of autumn came 3 nights later, without much warning beyond a heaviness in the air that the older villagers had learned over the years to read the way sailors read a change in the color of the sea. It began after dark, a low wind moving down from the hills that rattled the shutters gently at first, testing them, and then not gently at all. By midnight, it had grown into something with real weight behind it, tearing branches from the pines on the hill and sending them clattering across rooftops, driving rain sideways under eaves that had never before needed to keep out rain from that particular angle. Kenji woke to the sound of his own shutter banging loose against its frame, and lay in the dark a moment listening to the shape of the storm before he rose to see to it. By morning, the wind had passed, leaving behind the particular stillness that follows a storm. No birds yet, no wind, only the drip of water from every eave and branch in the village, and the sound, carried faintly from the direction of the river, of someone already shouting for help with a fallen tree. Kenji dressed and went out before he had eaten anything. The damage, once the full daylight showed it, was not so terrible as such storms sometimes were, but it was thorough. Half the copper leaves that had only just begun to color the hillside pines now lay scattered and sodden across every lane in the village. The fishing nets strung along the riverbank hung in ribbons, torn loose from their posts and dragged into the mud. Old Fenn's roof had lost 4 tiles to the wind, leaving a bare patch that let the grey morning light through onto his kitchen floor. The miller's shutter had come off one hinge entirely and lay half submerged in a puddle by his door. Kenji went from house to house that day the way he had gone from house to house after every storm he could remember, his tool bag over his shoulder, Hero trailing behind him with the heavier kit of nails and cord. He reset the miller's shutter before midday. He climbed onto Old Fenn's roof in the thin autumn sun and worked the loose tiles back into place, his knees pressed against the wet slope, his hands moving with the sure, unhurried confidence they always found in this kind of work. By afternoon, he was down at the riverbank with 3 other men, reweaving the torn nets thread by thread, the mud soaking through his boots, his fingers growing raw, and then, eventually, bleeding faintly at the tips where the wet cord had worked against them too many times. Hero brought him water twice and bread once, and had to say his name twice each time before Kenji looked up and remembered to eat. By the time the sun began to lower, every roof in Amber Hollow held its tiles again, every shutter hung true on its hinges, and the nets, though patched rather than new, would hold a catch through to spring. It was, by any measure, Kenji had ever used to measure such a day, a full and thorough day's work, the kind of day he would once have walked home from with a plain, uncomplicated satisfaction, the whole village a little more whole for the hours he had spent in it. Instead, he found himself sitting on the riverbank after the last net was strung, too tired to walk the short distance home just yet, his hands throbbing faintly in the cooling air. The river ran past him, high and brown from the rain, carrying broken branches and torn leaves toward the bend below the village and out of sight. It did not pause to consider the damage the storm had done along its banks. It did not slow to mend the torn nets or set the fallen branches back where they belonged. It only moved the way it always moved, indifferent to the night that had just passed through it, already smoothing its surface back into the long, familiar bends it had worn for itself over more years than any storm could touch. Kenji watched it for a long while, his arms resting on his knees, his hands too sore to close into fists even if he had wanted to. Down the bank, Hero sat a little apart from him, quiet in the way the boy had learned to be quiet after a hard day, and neither of them spoke for some time. A heron picked its way along the shallows below the bend, unbothered by the debris drifting past it. Somewhere behind them, in the village, someone had begun hammering a loose board back into place, the sound carrying thin and rhythmic across the wet evening air. "Everything's fixed," Hero said eventually, not quite a question. "Everything that could be," Kenji said. He meant it plainly, the way he meant most things he said at the end of a long working day, and did not think further about it. But he sat there longer than the walk home required, watching the river carry the storm's leavings away, without once looking back to see what had been left broken behind it, and found without quite being able to say why, that he did not especially want to move yet. The cold came down with the dusk. Eventually he rose, his knees stiff, his hands aching in a way that had nothing to do with the day's work alone, and the two of them walked back up the lane toward the shop, past the reset shutters and the freshly hammered boards. the village settling behind them into the ordinary quiet of an evening after a storm has passed. Down the lane from Kenji's shop, past the well and the low stone wall that marked the edge of the market square, stood the house of a widow named May, whose garden had been bordered for as long as anyone could remember by a simple wooden fence, the kind meant to keep out nothing in particular, only to mark plainly where the garden began and the lane ended. One section of that fence had been broken since the previous summer, when a wandering ox being led to market had leaned its full weight against it during the confusion of a crowded market day, splintering two of the lower slats and leaving a gap wide enough for a grown man to step through sideways. Kenji had offered to mend it more than once in the months since. Each time, May had thanked him and smiled and found some reason the work could wait. The season was wrong. The wood needed drying first. There was no hurry. He had let the matter go each time, the way one lets go of small things in a village where there is always something more urgent waiting at the bench. But the broken fence had stayed, quietly, in the back of his notice, the way an unfinished task always does for a man built the way Kenji was built. He was walking past on an ordinary afternoon, not long after the storm, his hands still faintly sore from the mending of nets and shutters, when May called to him from where she knelt among her cabbages, brushing frost from the outer leaves with the flat of her hand. "Come see something," she said, and waved him over, not toward the cabbages, but toward the broken section of fence itself. Kenji went, expecting, perhaps, that she had finally changed her mind about the repair. Instead, she only pointed at the gap in the slats, where a tangle of vines had crept through from the field beyond, climbing the broken wood in a loose, unplanned spiral, dotted here and there with the last of the season's morning glories, a deep, faded blue against the grey, weathered fence, the flowers already beginning to close for the coming evening. "They came through the break," May said. "There was nowhere for them to come through when the fence was whole." Kenji looked at the flowers a long moment. He had walked past this fence a dozen times since the ox had broken it, and had somehow never once noticed the vines threading through the gap, though they must have been growing there for weeks. "It's still broken, though," he said, more out of habit than conviction. "Is it?" May said, and went back to brushing frost from her cabbages, leaving the question sitting there in the cool afternoon air the way she left most things. Unhurried, unpressed, entirely willing to be picked up again, or set down and forgotten, whichever a person chose. Kenji stood by the fence a while longer after she had turned back to her work. The vines swayed faintly in a small wind moving down the lane, the last flowers nodding with it, and beyond the gap, further into the field, he could see where the same vine ran on, low along the ground, rooted somewhere well past the reach of May's garden entirely, as though the broken fence had simply become, without anyone deciding it should, one more ordinary point along a much longer growing thing that had never once needed a fence's permission to exist. He did not, that day, reach for his tools. He told himself it was only because May had asked him not to, the same reason as always, and this was true enough as far as it went. But he found himself glancing back at the fence once more, before he continued down a lane, the way a man glances back at something he has decided, for reasons he has not examined, to leave exactly as it is. The afternoon carried on around him in its ordinary way. A cart creaked past on the road to the mill. Somewhere near the well, two women were arguing pleasantly over the price of thread. Kenji walked on toward his shop, past the low stone wall, past the last of the market stalls closing for the day, and did not think of the fence again until he was nearly home, when the image of the morning glories against the broken slats returned to him, unbidden. The way a smell sometimes returns long after the kitchen it came from has gone quiet. He set his tools down that evening and did not pick up any new work at all, sitting instead for a while at his own bench with his hands simply resting on the wood, watching the last light fade from the open doorway, listening to the ordinary sounds of the village settling into evening around him. At the top of the hill above the village stood the stand of pines that gave Amber Hollow its color each autumn, planted, some of the older villagers said, 3 generations back by men who wanted a windbreak for the fields below. All of them had grown tall and straight over the years, their trunks rising in clean, unbroken lines toward the sky, all but one, near the center of the grove, which had grown crooked from its earliest years, bent low and sideways, before straightening again higher up, so that its shape from a distance looked something like a bow drawn halfway and left that way. Kenji remembered it from boyhood, remembered the older men arguing more than once about whether to cut it down. It spoiled the line of the grove, they said. It was, by any ordinary measure, a mistake of a tree, the kind that should have been removed years ago and replaced with something that grew the way a tree was supposed to grow. They never did cut it down. Out of laziness, some said, or simple superstition about disturbing a tree that old, and it had simply remained there among its straighter kin, bent and strange, the grove's one obvious flaw. He climbed the hill that afternoon, a few days after the storm, not for any particular reason he could have named, only that his legs seemed to want the climb, and the crooked pine was the first thing he looked for once he reached the grove, the way a person's eye goes first, without deciding to the one uneven stone in an otherwise level wall. It was still standing. What was not still standing were 4 of the straightest, tallest pines in the grove, their trunks snapped clean partway up, the broken halves lying scattered down the hillside, where the storm's full weight had caught them broadside and found nothing in their rigid, upright growth willing to give way. The crooked pine stood among the wreckage, bowed as always, its needles still green, a few small branches down, but the trunk itself whole. Kenji walked the length of the grove slowly, stepping over one of the fallen trunks, running his hand once along its splintered break, the way he might have examined any broken thing brought to his bench. The wood at the break was pale and clean, snapped rather than torn, the kind of fracture that comes from something that could not move enough to survive what pushed against it. He stood a long while at the base of the crooked pine itself afterward, looking up through its bent trunk to the branches still holding their needles against the grey sky. He did not have words for what he was looking at. Not yet, only the plain fact of it. The straight ones had broken, and the crooked one had not. He thought, without meaning to, and without following the thought very far, of the fishing nets down by the river, of how he had woven one of them weeks before, so tightly along its seams that it had nothing left to give when the current pulled hard against it, and had torn instead, again and again, in the exact place he had drawn it tightest. He did not connect this thought to the tree in any deliberate way. It simply arrived, sat beside the site of the broken trunks for a moment, and then went quiet again, the way a stray thought does when a man is tired and has not yet learned to follow where it leads. Higher up the hill, the wind moved through the crooked pine's branches, bending them gently without breaking anything at all, and Kenji stood beneath it a while longer, his hands loose at his sides, before starting back down toward the village as the light began to fail. He did not climb the hill again for some weeks after that, though he found more than once in the days that followed that his eye went to the shape of the crooked pine from the shop doorway whenever the hillside was visible through the thinning trees, bent, unremarkable at a distance, still standing. It was Hiro, in the end, who gave Kenji the reason to climb the hill again. The boy had taken to carrying a small basket of millet up to the old monk's hut once a week, an arrangement the village had settled into long before Kenji had ever apprenticed anyone to carry on it. A habit of quiet upkeep, the kind no one remembered starting and no one saw any reason to stop. That week, Hiro had come down with a fever well enough not to worry over, but stubborn enough to keep him by the fire. And so Kenji took the basket himself, telling himself it was only a favor. Nothing more, though he noticed, climbing the narrow path past the pines, that his feet seemed to know the way better than he expected them to. He found Taoyun outside the hut, not resting on the smooth stone as he sometimes did, but kneeling at a low fire pit, feeding thin branches into a small blaze beneath a blackened pot. "You've come instead of the boy," the old monk said, without turning, as though he had heard Kenji's steps long before they reached him. "He's unwell." "Nothing serious?" Kenji set the basket down near the fire. "I brought the millet." "Good. Sit then, if you've climbed all this way. The water wants watching, and I've grown too old to watch it and gather wood at the same time." Kenji had not expected to be handed a task, and found himself, before he had quite decided to accept it, kneeling by the fire pit with a stick in hand, nudging the coals the way he might have tended his own hearth. Taoyun rose slowly and moved off toward the tree line at the edge of the clearing, gathering fallen branches into the crook of his arm, unhurried, pausing now and then to consider one piece of wood over another before adding it to his small collection. They worked this way for a while without speaking, Kenji minding the fire, the old monk gathering wood, the pot beginning to steam faintly between them, the smell of boiling millet mixing with wood smoke, and the cold, clean scent of the pines overhead. "You're quieter than the boy," Taoyun observed eventually, returning with his armful of branches and settling them near the fire pit in a loose, unstacked pile. "He talks enough for the both of us. He asks good questions." Kenji glanced up at this. "He asked me one, not long ago. I didn't have much of an answer." "Which one?" "Why I fix things." Taoyun fed a branch into the fire, watched it catch, and said nothing for a moment, the silence settling comfortably between them rather than demanding to be filled. "And what did you tell him?" "That things should be whole." Kenji poked at the coals, watching a knot of wood collapse into embers. "It sounded truer when I said it to him than it does saying it to you." The old monk almost smiled at this, the corners of his mouth moving faintly before settling again. He did not offer an answer of his own, or correct what Kenji had said, and Kenji found, oddly, that he did not want him to. It was enough for the moment simply to sit at the small fire with the question left where it was, unresolved, warming his hands against the growing chill of the afternoon. When the millet was ready, Tao Yun ladled it into 2 bowls, his own cracked one and a second plainer bowl Kenji had not noticed before, kept, it seemed, for exactly this kind of visit. They ate without much conversation, the way men sometimes eat together when the meal itself is the whole of the occasion, needing no further purpose. Kenji noticed, without commenting on it, that the old monk ate from the cracked side of the bowl without any apparent care for which way the fracture turned, the same as he would have eaten from any other. Afterward, Tao Yun set his bowl aside and looked out past the fire toward the darkening valley below, where the first lamps of Amber Hollow were beginning to show through the dusk. "The boy will be well by tomorrow?" he asked. "By tomorrow, or the day after. Send him up when he is. I've missed his questions this week." Kenji gathered the empty bowls and the basket that had held the millet and rose to make his way back down the hill before full dark settled over the path. At the edge of the clearing, he paused, glancing back once, not at any symbol, not at any crack or bend or gap, only at the old monk himself, still seated by the low fire, feeding it one more branch against the coming cold, entirely at ease in the fading light, the way a man is at ease in a room he has lived in for a very long time. Kenji walked down through the darkening pines with the empty basket swinging loosely from his hand, and found without any particular reason he could point to that the walk felt shorter than the climb up had been. The ache in Kenji's hands had been growing for some months by then, a small stiffness in the knuckles that showed itself first thing in the morning and eased usually by midday once the work had warmed them through. He had said little about it to anyone, and thought of it, when he thought of it at all, as simply one more ordinary cost of a life spent close to tools. On a cold morning, not long after his visit to Tao Yun's hut, a farmer named Osamu brought in a 3-legged stool with a wobble in one joint, the kind of small, ordinary repair Kenji could usually finish before the man had even settled onto the bench to wait for it. Kenji turned the stool over, found the loose joint at once, and reached for his glue pot the way he always did, and then paused, the pot in his hand, his eyes on the wobbling leg, for no reason he could have named if asked. It was a small pause, no longer than a breath. "Leave it a few days," he heard himself say. "I've a run of harder work ahead of it." He was not entirely sure, even as he said it, why he had said it. There was no harder work waiting. The bench behind him held nothing more pressing than the stool itself. Osamu blinked, the way a man blinks at a small thing that costs him nothing. "It's only the one joint," he said, half a question. "I know it." Kenji did not offer anything further, and after a moment Osamu shrugged and left the stool leaning against the wall by the door, wobbling faintly whenever the wind through the doorway caught it. Kenji went back to the bench and took up a different task, and did not think much more about the stool that morning. But he noticed it there each time he crossed the room, leaning, unfixed, in plain sight of anyone who came through the door, and found, oddly, that the sight of it did not trouble him the way an unfinished repair usually did. He could not have said why this was so. It simply was, the way a held breath is sometimes let out before a person notices they had been holding it. The stool stayed that way for 3 days, On the third evening, with no particular thought behind it, he finally set it upright on the bench and mended the loose joint in the time it would have taken him the very first morning. A small repair, over almost before it began. He handed it back to Osamu the next day without comment, and Osamu took it without comment in return, and neither of them spoke of the 3 days it had waited, as though the waiting itself had left no mark at all on the world, however faint a mark it may have left elsewhere. It was around this time that Kenji began to notice something in Hiro that sat with him longer than most things did. The boy had taken, over the past weeks, to straightening things that did not need straightening. A chair that stood perfectly well would be nudged an inch this way or that, until its legs sat even on the floor. A seam in his own sleeve, sound and whole, would be picked out and re-sewn, because Hiro judged the stitches not quite fine enough. The shelves along the back wall, which held the shop's various finished mendings, had been rearranged 3 times in a single week, each time with some small correction Hiro seemed to feel was necessary, though Kenji, looking at the shelves before and after, could never quite see what had changed. He noticed it the way a man notices rain building before the first drop falls, not all at once, but as a gathering weight in the air that becomes eventually impossible to ignore. On a quiet afternoon, with the shop empty of customers and the fire burned low, Kenji found the boy bent over a bench leg with a scraping tool, working at a spot along the wood that carried no crack at all, only the ordinary unevenness of hand-cut grain, the kind of small variation every piece of furniture in the shop carried somewhere, the kind Kenji himself had stopped noticing on his own work years ago. He watched for a while without speaking. Hiro's strokes were careful, controlled, the same patient rhythm Kenji had taught him for smoothing a genuine flaw, a rhythm meant for mending, being spent now on wood that had nothing wrong with it at all. "Hiro," Kenji said eventually. "What are you doing?" "Making it right," the boy said, not looking up, the scraper still moving in its small, even strokes. Kenji crossed the room and stood beside the bench, looking down at the leg the boy had been working. The grain a little paler now, where the scraper had passed over it, again and again, the surrounding wood untouched and darker by comparison, so that what had once been a single, unremarkable piece of furniture now carried in its place a faint new unevenness of its own making. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he reached down and closed his hand gently over the boy's, stilling the scraper mid-stroke, and Hiro looked up at him at last, uncertain, the tool still caught between them. "It was already right," Kenji said. Hiro's brow furrowed, the way it did when a thing he believed settled was being quietly unsettled. "But you always find something to fix," he said, "even when no one else can see it." Kenji had no answer ready for this. None of the plain, settled phrases he usually reached for at the bench. He only held the boy's hand still a moment longer, feeling the small resistance in it slowly ease, and then took the scraper from him, not sharply, only firmly, the way one takes a tool from a hand that has, for the moment, forgotten what it was reaching for. He set the scraper down on the bench, out of reach, and did not pick up any other tool in its place. He sat instead on the low stool beside Hiro, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all. The fire ticked and settled in the hearth. Outside, the last light of the afternoon moved slowly across the floor of the shop. touching the legs of the bench, the shelves, the two of them sitting quietly together, and neither Kenji nor the boy reached in all that time for anything at all that needed correcting. Down by the river, some days later, old Fen came to the shop with a different kind of trouble than Kenji was used to hearing from him. "My net keeps tearing," Fen said, laying the mesh out across the bench, the very net Kenji had rewoven himself after the autumn storm, its cord still new enough to hold most of its color. "Always the same place. I mend it, I use it a day or two, and it goes again, right along that seam." Kenji ran his fingers along the length Fen pointed to and found the trouble before he had gone very far. He had knotted this section weeks before, tighter than the rest, each loop drawn hard against its neighbor, the whole seam pulled taut, the kind of careful, thorough work he had always taken a particular pride in. There was, along that stretch, no slack anywhere at all. "You wove it well," Fen said, not unkindly, "but it keeps giving out in the same spot." Kenji turned the net over in his hands, tracing the tight seam with his thumb, and said nothing for a moment. He thought of nothing in particular as he did. No crooked tree, no cracked bowl, only the plain, practical fact of the cord in his hands and the place where it kept failing. "Leave it with me," he said. He re-knotted the section that evening after Fen had gone, working slowly by the last of the daylight through the open door. This time, he left small loops of slack along the length of it, room enough for the mesh to shift when the current pulled hard against it, rather than holding its shape rigid against a force that would only find the tightest point and tear there instead. Fen came back for it 2 days later, running the re-knotted seam through his fingers with some suspicion. "Won't it come loose, woven this way?" "It will move instead of breaking," Kenji said. Fen took the net down to the river that same afternoon to test it, and Kenji did not follow to watch, returning instead to the ordinary work waiting at his bench. It was 3 days before Fen came by again, this time simply to say, in passing, that the net had held, that it had shifted and stretched with the current more than once, by his own eye, and had not torn anywhere since. Kenji nodded at this and said he was glad to hear it, and went back to the repair in front of him, the exchange settling into the day the way most small exchanges did, without much ceremony. He did not dwell that evening on what the net might mean beyond being a net that now held a catch. He only noticed later, coiling a length of spare cord for some other task, that his hands had begun leaving a little more slack in their knots than they used to, almost without his choosing it. A habit shifting quietly beneath his notice, the way a path through grass shifts slowly with each new season's walking, long before anyone thinks to ask when the old way was left behind. Sleep came unevenly to Kenji that season, more nights than not, his hands aching too dully to settle into rest at the hour they used to. On one such night, with the ache sitting low and stubborn in his knuckles and the house too quiet to hold his attention, he rose, dressed against the cold, and walked down to the river alone. The moon hung nearly full above the valley, casting the water in a pale, moving light. Where the current ran fastest, near the bend below the old fishing posts, the moon's reflection broke apart into 100 small, trembling pieces, scattering and rejoining, never once holding still long enough to form the single clean circle it made in the sky overhead. Kenji sat on the bank a while, his knees drawn up, his sore hands resting loose in his lap. He watched the moon fail over and over to hold its shape on the water's surface, and found, without deciding to find it, that some part of him did not want it to succeed. A moon lying still and whole on calm water would have been, he thought, only correct, the kind of thing a man expects and stops truly seeing. This moon, breaking and reassembling 1,000 times a minute under the river's pull, was something else. It seemed, in a way he did not try to put into words, more alive for never holding still. He sat there long enough that the cold began to work its way past his coat, and still he did not rise, watching the light scatter and gather, scatter and gather, the current never once pausing to let it settle. Somewhere behind him, on the path down from the village, he heard Hiro's uneven footsteps before the boy reached him. The particular quick, light tread Kenji had come to know from years of the boy trailing him on errands. "You weren't in your bed," Hiro said, settling onto the bank beside him without being asked, pulling his own coat tighter against the chill. "Couldn't sleep?" The hands. Some. Kenji did not offer more than that, and Hiro did not ask for more. The two of them sitting together in the cold instead, looking out at the same broken light on the water. "It never stays still," Hiro said after a while, watching the moon scatter again where a fish rose somewhere upstream and sent new ripples spreading through the reflection. "No," Kenji said, "it doesn't." He did not say anything further about it, and neither did Hiro. And they sat together a while longer in the cold dark, the river moving past them exactly as it always had, needing nothing from either of them, until the chill finally sent them both back up the path toward the warmth of the shop, leaving the moon behind them still breaking and gathering itself on the water, undisturbed by their leaving. The next time Tao Yun came down into the village, it was Hiro who spotted him first, resting in his usual place beneath the shop's deep eaves, and came to fetch Kenji from the bench. Kenji came out and settled onto the bench beside the old monk without much ceremony, the way he might have settled beside Hiro at the river, and for a while neither of them spoke, the market moving past them in its ordinary midday rhythm, a cart creaking by, someone haggling over the price of dried fish, a child laughing somewhere near the well. At some point, without any particular occasion for it, Tao Yun drew the cracked bowl from the folds of his robe and set it on the bench between them, the way he sometimes did, turning it once so the crack caught what light made it beneath the eaves. Kenji looked at it. He did not reach for it. He did not offer, as he once would have without thinking, to seal the crack before the old monk continued on his way. He only looked at the fine silvered line running from rim to base, worn smooth rather than sharp by however many years of handling, and said nothing at all. "You haven't offered to mend it," Tao Yun observed after a while, not quite a question. "No," Kenji said. "Why not?" Kenji considered this honestly, the way he had lately begun to consider most things put to him, rather than reaching at once for whatever answer came easiest. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "It simply didn't occur to me to offer." Tao Yun made a small sound at this, something between a hum and the beginning of a laugh, and turned the bowl once more in his weathered hands before setting it back into his robe. He did not explain the sound, and Kenji did not ask him to. They sat together a while longer as the market moved around them, saying little else. And when Taoyun finally rose to continue on toward the far stalls, he paused a moment at the edge of the eaves. "The bowl thanks you," he said, "for leaving it be," and walked on with his slow, unhurried steps before Kenji could decide whether the old monk was joking or whether he meant it exactly as he'd said it. Kenji sat a while longer on the bench after he had gone, turning the small exchange over without quite arriving anywhere with it, and then went back to the bench, where a mended clasp waited half-finished, and picked up his work again. The crack in the old monk's bowl carried on down the lane and out of sight, entirely unmended, exactly as it had been all along. Winter came on properly not long after, the frost settling deep into the ground and staying there through the mornings, the market square quieter now than it had been in autumn. Most of the village's business drawn indoors to firesides and low windows. Kenji was crossing the square one grey morning when the miller's wife stopped him near the well, her basket of washing balanced on one hip. "You should see to the widow May's fence before the snow comes," she said, not unkindly, the way villagers sometimes said such things about a neighbour they worried after more than they let on. "It's not right. A broken fence left standing all this time, and her alone in that house now. People will start to say she can't keep the place." Kenji said only that he would look in on her, which was true enough, and continued down the lane past the water barrel and the low stone wall, thinking less about the fence itself than about the particular way the miller's wife had said "alone in that house now," a phrase that seemed to carry more weight than the fence deserved on its own. He found May at the far edge of her garden, kneeling in the frost-hardened dirt, cutting back the last of the dead vines from the broken section with a small knife, gathering the dry stems into a loose bundle at her side. "Clearing them for the winter?" Kenji asked, coming to stand near the gap in the fence. "Some of them. Not all." She held up one length of vine before adding it to the bundle, turning it in the grey light. "These came from my husband's garden, the old one, before we built this house. He trained them along a low wall there the same way, for years before I ever knew him. Said morning glories always find the lowest gap in a wall if you let them, no matter how carefully you plant them elsewhere." Kenji looked at the broken fence a moment, at the low, wide gap where the vines had climbed all autumn, and said nothing, only nodding slowly. "When the ox broke this section," May went on, "I thought at first I'd lost the plants entirely. They'd wound themselves so thick along the old slats, but they only found the new gap instead, same as they always have. I've stopped trying to guess where he'd have wanted them to grow. I only watch where they go." She said this plainly, without any particular weight behind it, the way she said most things about her days, not as a lesson offered, only as an account of an ordinary morning's work. She finished bundling the dead vines, set them aside for the compost heap near the shed, and moved on to the next row of the garden, brushing frost from a line of turnip greens with the same unhurried attention she'd given the vines. Kenji stayed a while longer, not because there was anything left to discuss about the fence, but because May had begun pulling the last of the season's root vegetables and seemed glad enough of a second pair of hands, cold as his had grown. He knelt beside her in the frozen dirt and worked without much conversation, the two of them clearing the row together as the grey morning wore on. the broken fence standing behind them the whole while, the frost settling white along its splintered edges where the dead vines had been cut away. When the row was cleared, May thanked him for the help, and he thanked her for the tea she offered before he left, and neither of them spoke again of the fence, or of what the miller's wife might say about it, or of anything requiring an answer at all. He walked back up the lane with the cold working into his hands, past the water barrel, past the low stone wall, and did not stop again at the sight of the broken slats behind him, though he did not either find himself troubled by having left them exactly as they were. The first heavy snow of the season brought with it a small leak in the corner of Kenji's own roof, above the shelf where he kept his spare cord and lesser tools. A slow, steady drip that began sometime in the night and continued through the following days, whenever the snow on the roof softened enough in the daylight to seep through some gap in the shingles Kenji had never gotten around to inspecting. He noticed it the first morning by the small dark stain spreading across the floorboards, and set a shallow dish beneath it before it could reach the cord, the way he might have done for any minor trouble while waiting for a better moment to climb up and see to the real cause. The better moment did not come that week, nor the next. The snow kept the roof too slick to climb safely, or so Kenji told himself each time he considered it, and the dish beneath the leak filled slowly enough that emptying it once a day was no real burden. It became, without much decision on his part, simply one more small task folded into the shop's daily rhythm. Sweep the floor, bank the fire, empty the dish by the shelf. Hiro noticed it on the coldest night of that stretch, glancing over at the dish from where he sat mending a torn glove by the fire, the steady drip marking time in the quiet room like a slow, patient clock. "Should I climb up and look at it tomorrow?" he asked. "The snow's hardened enough on the south side, I think." Kenji considered this, turning the question over rather than answering at once the way he might once have. "Not yet," he said finally. "Let's see how the week goes." Hiro glanced at him, then back at the dish, and did not press further, returning to the glove in his lap. The fire ticked and settled. The drip continued its slow rhythm from the corner, steady enough that after a while, it seemed less an interruption to the quiet than a part of it, the way the wind against the shutters or the occasional creak of the roof settling under snow had long ago become part of the ordinary sound of a winter evening in that shop. They sat that way a good while, the two of them close by the fire, Hiro's needle moving in small, even stitches through the worn leather, Kenji turning a length of cord in his hands without any particular task in mind for it, both of them listening, without remarking on it, to the small water clock keeping its patient count in the corner of the room. "It doesn't bother you," Hiro said eventually, not quite a question. Leaving it like that, Kenji thought about this honestly before answering, watching the firelight move across the dark stain on the floorboards. "Some nights more than others," he admitted. "Tonight, not especially." Hiro nodded at this, the way he had lately taken to nodding at his master's answers, not fully satisfied perhaps, but willing to let the matter rest where it lay, the same way the leak itself was being let to rest, unmended, marking its slow, steady rhythm through the cold winter dark, until whatever better moment eventually came to see to it properly. A trader came through Amber Hollow that winter on his way to the coast, a broad, weathered man named Torio, who dealt in the sort of goods that moved slowly through mountain villages. Good rope, tar, iron fittings for boats that would not be built until spring. He stopped at Kenji's shop to have a cracked axle pin replaced, and it was while Hiro was fitting the new pin into place, his hands quick and sure despite the cold, that Torio watched him work for a long moment and said, to Kenji rather than the boy, "You've taught him well. I could use hands like that at the yards. We're always short of good apprentices who don't mind the smell of tar." Kenji said only that Hiro was needed at the bench, which was true, and Torio did not press the matter, paying for the repair and continuing on toward the coast road before the light failed. But Hiro had heard the words plainly enough and said nothing about them that evening, though Kenji noticed him standing longer than usual at the open door after the shop had closed, looking down the darkening lane in the direction the trader's cart had gone. It was 3 days before Hiro brought it up himself, the two of them splitting firewood behind the shop in the thin midday sun, the frozen logs stacked between them, the rhythm of the axe falling steady and unhurried, the way such work always went once a man's arms had found their pace. "Do you think I'd be good at it?" Hiro asked, setting a fresh log on the block. "Building boats." Kenji swung the axe, the log splitting clean in two, and set the halves aside before answering. "I think you'd be good at most things you set your hands to, seriously." "That's not really an answer." "No," Kenji admitted. "It isn't." Hiro set another log on the block and did not swing at it right away, turning it once to find the grain the way Kenji had taught him years before. "I keep thinking about the sea. I've never seen it. Torio said it goes on further than a person can walk in a week." "I've never seen it either," Kenji said. They worked a while longer without speaking, the axe passing back and forth between them, the pile of split wood growing steadily at their feet. Kenji found, swinging the axe through another log, that he did not have any of his usual settled answers ready for this. No plain phrase that closed the matter the way he might once have closed a repair. He was not sure, in fact, what he wanted to say to the boy at all, only that some part of him did not want to say anything that would push the decision one way or the other. "You don't have to decide today," he said eventually, which was true, and which was also, he suspected, the only honest thing he had to offer. Hiro nodded at this, swinging his own axe down through the log in his hands, the wood splitting with a sharp, clean crack that echoed off the back wall of the shop. "I know," he said. "I just wanted you to know I was thinking about it. I'm glad you told me." They finished the wood pile as the afternoon wore toward evening, saying little else about the coast or the trader or what the boy might decide once spring opened the roads again. When the work was done, they carried the split wood inside together, stacking it by the hearth, and Kenji found himself glancing at Hiro once or twice while they worked, not searching for anything in particular, only noticing, the way a man notices how much taller a boy has grown since the last time he thought to measure it against the doorframe. He said nothing about this either. The fire caught easily that evening from the freshly split wood, and the two of them sat by it a while before turning in. The question of the sea and the boatyards, left where Hiro had set it down, unanswered, neither pressed toward nor pushed away. Simply there, the way most large questions are, waiting for whatever season would eventually bring an answer with it. May fell ill in the deepest part of that winter. A fever that came on suddenly after a week of hard cold, keeping her to her bed for longer than anyone in the village could remember her being unwell before. The herbalist came and went with her tinctures, and a neighbor took over the feeding of the chickens, and word passed quietly from house to house, the way such news does in a small village. Not alarmed exactly, but attentive, the kind of watchfulness that gathers around someone who has always managed alone. Kenji went to see her on the fourth day, not with any tool in hand, since there was nothing in her small house that needed his particular kind of mending. He brought instead a covered pot of broth Hero had made that morning, thick with barley and the last of the autumn's dried mushrooms, and found May propped up in her bed, pale and thinner looking than he remembered her. Though her eyes were clear enough when she saw who had come. "You didn't need to climb all this way in the cold," she said, her voice rough from the fever. Hero made the broth. "I only carried it." She managed something like a smile at that, and let him set the pot near the small fire to warm. And for a while neither of them spoke. Kenji, sitting on the low stool beside her bed, the way he had once sat beside Taoyun's fire, listening to the wind test the shutters outside. "I keep thinking of the garden," May said eventually, half to herself. "Whether the frost's gotten into the last of the turnip row, whether the fence has held against the wind." "The fence is standing," Kenji said. "I passed it yesterday." "And the row?" "I couldn't say. I didn't think to look." She nodded at this, closing her eyes for a moment, and Kenji sat with her in the quiet that followed, not reaching for anything to say that might ease the worry, only staying near enough that she was not alone with it. There was nothing, after all, that his hands could do for a fever, or for the loneliness of lying ill in a house with no one else in it. No crack to seal, no seam to reknot, only the plain fact of a woman unwell, and a man willing to sit beside her until the broth was warm enough to eat. When it was ready, he ladled some into a small bowl and helped her sit up enough to manage it herself, and she ate slowly, in small, careful spoonfuls, the color returning faintly to her face as the warmth of it settled in her. "Tell Hero it's good broth," she said when she'd finished as much as she could manage. "I will." He stayed a while longer after that, banking her fire higher against the evening chill, filling her water jug from the barrel outside before the light failed entirely, and it was full dark by the time he made his way back down the lane toward his own shop, the empty pot swinging loosely from his hand, the cold biting sharper now that the sun was fully gone. He did not think, walking home, that he had fixed anything at all that day. He had only sat with someone through an hour of her illness, and carried a pot of broth up a cold lane, and banked a fire that was not his own. Small, unremarkable tasks that left nothing changed in any way he could point to. And yet the walk home felt to him no less worth having made for that. By the time the worst of winter had settled fully over the valley, Kenji had taken to climbing the hill every week or so without needing an excuse of millet or fever to carry up with him. It had become, without either of them remarking on it, simply part of the season's rhythm. The mender and the old monk, spending an hour or two together at whatever small task the hut required. That week, it was wood. Taoyun's supply had grown thin against the cold, and his own strength, Kenji noticed without saying so, seemed thinner too. The old monk's hands slower now, at splitting even the smallest branches, his breath showing longer in the cold air before he managed each swing. "I'll take the axe," Kenji said, when he saw how the work was going. And Tao Yun did not argue, only nodded and settled onto the smooth stone near the fire pit, taking a moment longer than usual to lower himself down, one hand braced against the stone until he was sure of his seat. They fell into a rhythm quickly, Kenji splitting the logs, Tao Yun sorting the pieces by size into two piles, one for kindling and one for the slower burning wood that would carry the fire through the night. Neither of them spoke for a long while. The only sounds were the axe falling, the crack of splitting wood, the small shifting of branches as Tao Yun sorted them, and somewhere above the clearing, the wind moving steadily through the pines. Once, reaching for a larger branch at the edge of the pile, the old monk's hand missed its grip on the first try, and he had to reach again, more slowly, before the wood came properly into his hold. He said nothing about it, and Kenji, glancing over from the chopping block, said nothing either, only swung the axe again and let the small moment pass into the ordinary rhythm of the afternoon. "You've been coming more often," Tao Yun said eventually, not looking up from the wood in his hands. "The winters are long," Kenji said, which was true, though it was not quite the whole of his reason. Tao Yun made a small sound at this, not quite agreement, not quite anything else, and went on sorting the wood into its two piles. Kenji swung the axe again, the log splitting clean, and set the halves aside, and for a while the work continued in its steady, wordless way, the pile of split wood growing slowly at the edge of the clearing. "The boy," Tao Yun said after a long silence, "is he still thinking of the sea?" "He hasn't said lately. I haven't asked." "Good," the old monk said. "Some things settle better left alone for a while." Kenji glanced at him at this, half expecting some further remark to follow. Some small teaching folded into the words, the way he had once assumed everything Tao Yun said carried a lesson beneath it. None came. The old monk only went back to sorting the wood, pausing once to catch his breath before lifting the next piece, his weathered hands moving slowly but surely through the task. And Kenji found, swinging the axe again, that he did not mind the silence that followed nearly as much as he once might have needed to fill it. They finished as the light began to fail, the wood pile stacked neatly against the side of the hut, enough, by Kenji's rough count, to see Tao Yun through a good stretch of the remaining cold. The old monk thanked him plainly, the way he thanked people for most things, and rose from the stone slowly, steadying himself a moment with a hand against the hut's low doorframe before he found his balance. Kenji made his way back down the darkening path with his hands raw from the axe and his breath showing white in the last of the daylight, the hut and its small fire growing distant and warm-lit behind him until the bend in the path carried it out of sight. He did not think, walking down, that anything in particular had passed between them that afternoon worth remembering in words. Only wood split and sorted and stacked, and an old man's hands grown a little slower than they had been the season before. Small, ordinary facts that sat with him anyway. The whole quiet walk home. Spring came slowly to the valley that year, the frost loosening its hold on the ground by careful degrees rather than all at once. And it was in the last thin days of that thaw that word reached the shop. The old monk had grown too weak to manage the hut alone, and his relatives from the next valley over had come with a cart to take him to live out whatever time remained to him under a roof where someone could tend the fire and the meals without his having to rise for them himself. Kenji heard it from the miller in passing, the way most news reached him, not urgent in the telling, only a fact laid down among other facts of the day. He set down the tool in his hand and walked up the hill that same afternoon, though he could not have said, starting out, what he expected to find there. The hut was empty when he arrived. Not ransacked, not disturbed. Simply empty, the way a room looks when someone has left it carefully, taking only what could be carried and leaving the rest exactly as it stood. The low fire pit was cold. The single sleeping mat was rolled and set against the wall. A neighbor from further down the valley road, who had helped load the cart that morning, told Kenji only that Taoyun had gone peacefully enough, sitting upright the whole ride down the hill, asking after no one and complaining of nothing. Kenji stood in the doorway a while, not stepping fully inside. The way a man stands at the edge of a room he is not certain still belongs to him to enter. The light came in low through the single window, catching the dust that had begun, in just this one afternoon's absence, to settle undisturbed across the floor. It was on the windowsill that he found the bowl. It sat there plainly, the way it had sat on so many benches and stones over the years, the crack running from rim to base, catching the low afternoon light. Whether Taoyun had left it there on purpose or simply forgotten it in the small confusion of leaving, Kenji never learned, and no one he asked afterward could say either. He did not pick it up right away. He stood a while longer in the empty hut, looking at the cold fire pit, the rolled mat, the bare walls that had never held more than the old monk needed, and nothing else besides, and found that the quiet of the place pressed on him in a way he had not expected a simple absence to press. Eventually he crossed the room and took the bowl from the sill, turning it once in his hands, the way he had watched Taoyun turn it 100 times before, the crack familiar to his fingers, now in a way it had not been the first time he'd offered to mend it. He did not consider even for a moment taking it to his bench. He only held it, and then wrapped it carefully in a fold of cloth from his bag, and carried it back down the hill as the light began to fail. Hiro was sweeping the shop floor when Kenji came in, and looked up at the sight of his face before he'd said a single word. "He's gone then," Hiro said, not quite a question. Gone to his family, in the next valley. Not gone entirely. Kenji set the wrapped bowl carefully on the shelf beside his own workbench, in among the tools rather than the finished mendings, and did not explain further why he had placed it there rather than anywhere else. Hiro came to stand beside him, looking at the bundle of cloth without unwrapping it. "Will you see him again?" "I don't know," Kenji said honestly. "The road's not so far. I might." Neither of them said anything further about it that evening. Hiro went back to his sweeping, and Kenji sat at the bench for a while without picking up any tool at all, the shop settling into its ordinary evening quiet around him, the fire ticking, the last light fading from the open door, the cracked bowl sitting wrapped and unremarked upon on its shelf, exactly where he had chosen, without quite deciding to, that it would stay. Torio's cart came back through Amber Hollow in the first full week of spring. The roads dried enough by then for easy travel, and this time it was Hiro who went out to meet him at the crossroads before the trader had even reached the shop. Kenji watched from the doorway as the two of them spoke, Torio nodding at whatever Hiro was saying and did not go out to join them, only waited until the boy came back inside, his face carrying the particular mix of certainty and nervousness that comes with a decision finally made rather than merely considered.
He says there's room on the cart if I want it, Hiro said.
He leaves in 3 days.
Kenji set down the awl he'd been holding. And you want it?
I think I do. Hiro looked at him carefully, as though gauging what the words would cost. Only for a season to start, to see if the work suits me before I decide anything larger. That sounds like a fair way to decide, Kenji said, and found, saying it, that he meant it plainly, without the small ache he half expected to find beneath the words. They spent the 3 days that followed much as they spent any other, the shop's ordinary rhythm carrying them through. Small repairs brought in and finished, the woodpile restocked, the shelves swept and set in order. Kenji taught Hiro nothing new in those days that he had not already taught him 100 times before, only worked alongside him as he always had, the two of them moving through the familiar tasks with the same easy, wordless coordination they had built over years at the same bench. On the evening before the cart was due, Kenji went to the shelf where the wrapped bowl sat among his tools, and beside it, further back, the plain chipped teacup that had sat there unmended since the autumn before. He took the cup down and turned it once in the firelight, the small clean chip along its rim catching the glow, and set it in Hiro's hands without much ceremony.
For the road, he said. It pours well enough, chip and all.
Hiro looked at the cup a moment, turning it the way Kenji had turned it 100 times himself, and did not ask why it had never been mended, or why Kenji had chosen this particular cup to give him rather than a whole one from the shelf. He only wrapped it carefully in a scrap of cloth and tucked it into the small bag he'd begun packing for the journey. The cart left at first light, the whole village turning out briefly to see it off the way. Villages do for any departure, however small. Kenji walked with Hiro as far as the bend in the road where the lane to Amber Hollow met the wider coast road, the two of them saying little, the morning still cold enough to show their breath. "You're right. If there's someone passing this way who can carry a letter," Kenji said, more a request than a question.
"I will." Hiro shifted the pack on his shoulder, glancing back once toward the shop, now small and distant behind the curve of the lane. "You'll be all right, at the bench alone?" "I managed well enough before you came," Kenji said. "I expect I'll manage again."
It was, he thought, watching the words leave his own mouth, a lighter thing to say than he might once have made of it. No longer counting of all the boy had come to mean to the shop, no request veiled as advice meant to keep him close. Only a plain fact, offered plainly, and left to stand on its own. Torio's cart rolled up alongside them, and Hiro climbed onto the bench beside the trader, settling his pack at his feet, and looked back once more at Kenji standing at the bend in the road.
"Thank you," Hiro said, "for not telling me what to choose."
Kenji only nodded at this, not trusting himself, in that particular moment, to add anything further to it. The cart pulled away down the widening road, the wheels catching the morning light, and Kenji stood at the bend a while longer, watching it grow smaller against the pale hills until the road curved out of sight, and there was nothing left to watch at all. He walked back to the shop alone, the lane quieter than he remembered it being in years, and set to sweeping the floor himself that morning.
the broom moving in slow, even strokes through the empty room, the bench waiting exactly where it always had, ready for whatever small brokenness the day would bring to it. Same as any other morning before this one.
Years passed in Amber Hollow the way they tend to pass in small villages, marked less by any single event than by the slow turning of the pines from green to copper and back again, season folding quietly into season until it grew difficult to say exactly when one had given way to the next. Kenji grew old at his bench. His hands, which had ached for so many winters, grew stiffer still, until some mornings he sat a good while by the fire before they loosened enough for careful work, and he had long since stopped expecting any tonic to change this. He kept at the mending anyway, slower now, taking on less than he once had, though the shop at the crossroads never quite emptied of the small, ordinary brokenness a village always produces. A hinge here, a handle there, a bowl brought in now and then by someone's grandchild, cracked the same simple way bowls had always cracked. A letter had come from the coast that first autumn after Hero left, in a careful, still-forming hand describing salt air and the strange, endless grey-green of the sea. And then, less frequently as the years went on, other letters followed. News of an apprenticeship completed, a small boat of his own design, eventually a wife and children who would in time be brought inland once to see the valley their father still spoke of. Kenji kept each letter folded in a box beside the bench,
and did not need to reread them often to know they were there.
Tao Yun had passed the following spring, word of it carried up the valley by a trader who had heard it from the relatives who'd taken him in, peacefully, in his sleep, without any particular fuss, in a manner that seemed, when Kenji heard the account of it, entirely in keeping with how the old man had lived. Kenji had walked up to the empty hut on the hill once more that season, finding it already claimed by weather and birds, and had not gone back again after that, though he thought of the old monk often enough in the years that followed, usually not in any deliberate remembering, but simply in the ordinary course of an afternoon, the way one thinks of an old friend at the sight of a familiar hillside. May lived on in her small house down the lane, older now herself. Her garden a little smaller each year, as her strength allowed for less of it, though the broken section of fence remained exactly as it always had. The morning glories climbing through it faithfully each spring, blooming and fading with the seasons, the same as they always had, needing no permission from anyone to keep doing so. The crooked pine still stood on the hill, bowed as ever, unremarkable now even to Kenji's eye most days, simply one more familiar shape against the sky, among the younger trees that had grown up around the stumps of the ones the storm had felled so many years before. On quiet evenings when his hands ached too much for further work and the shop had gone still around him, Kenji sometimes walked down to the river, more slowly now than he once had, and sat a while on the same bank where he had watched the moon those many years before. It still scattered itself across the moving water. Each night it rose full, still refused to hold its shape for longer than a breath, and Kenji still found, watching it, that he did not particularly wish it would. He had taken on no apprentice since Hero left, though a boy from a neighboring farm had begun, in recent months, coming by after his chores to watch the mending done, the way Kenji himself had once watched his grandfather's hands at this same bench. Kenji let him stay and answered his questions when they came, though he found he no longer reached quite so quickly for a settled answer to give them, content, more often now, to let a question sit unresolved between them for a while, the way certain things are better left to settle on their own than forced too soon toward any particular shape. On the shelf above his bench, in among the ordinary tools of his trade, 2 cracked bowls still sat side by side in the lamplight each evening. His own, chipped that long ago spring morning, and Tao Yun's, wrapped once in cloth and unwrapped again, not long after. Both of them used now and then for whatever small meal the day required. Neither one ever sealed, neither one any less whole for the years of use worn into their cracks. The valley settled into evening around him, the way it always had, the pines darkening against the last color in the sky, the river moving on below the village, exactly as it always had moved, carrying whatever the season brought to it toward the bend and out of sight, needing no one's hand to find its way home. Kenji sat a while longer by his own low fire before banking the coals for the night, in no particular hurry to reach the end of the evening, content simply to be there for as much of it as remained. An old man in an old shop at the edge of an old and unhurried valley, with nothing in particular that still needed fixing, and no urgency at all in the noticing of that.